He lost. Every history book agrees on that. Rome crushed his rebellion, crucified thousands of his men along a single road as a warning, and made sure no one would remember his name kindly. And somehow, 2,000 years later, his name is the one people still know. Not Crassus, the man who beat him. This is the story of a slave who was never supposed to be more than property, and how he came closer to breaking Rome than almost anyone in her history, and why losing didn't erase what he built. We don't know much about Spartacus before Rome owned him. Ancient sources disagree even on where he was born. Likely Thrace, a region Rome had already been at war with for generations. What we do know is that at some point he ended up a soldier, then a deserter or prisoner, and eventually as property. Sold into a gladiator school in Capua, run by a man named Lentulus Vetiatus. A ludus like this wasn't a sports academy. It was a machine for turning condemned men into disposable entertainment, trained to kill efficiently and die publicly. The discipline forced on Spartacus here wasn't the kind that builds a person. It was designed to break one down into a tool. Daily combat drills. No name that mattered beyond a fighting title. No future beyond the next match, or the one after that, until eventually you lost one. Most men who passed through a ludus like this either died in the arena or spent their whole life believing that was simply the order of things. Spartacus didn't believe that. 73 BC, Spartacus and roughly 70 other gladiators decide they'd rather die attempting freedom than wait for the arena to kill them on schedule. They arm themselves with kitchen knives and cleavers seized from the training school's kitchen. Barely weapons at all, fight their way past the guards and escape into the countryside. On the road out, they ambush a wagon transporting actual gladiatorial weapons and armor, and suddenly 70 escaped slaves with kitchen knives become 70 armed fighters. They take refuge on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Rome initially doesn't take this seriously. This is a slave uprising, a policing matter, not a war. A local force of a few thousand men is sent to contain them, blockading the single known path down the mountain. Spartacus's response was to do something the blockading force never considered. His men wove ropes and vines from wild grapevines growing on the mountainside, climbed down a sheer cliff face the Romans hadn't bothered to guard, and ambushed the Roman camp from a direction they thought was impossible. 70 escaped slaves with stolen knives had just handed a Roman military force its first defeat. Word spread. Enslaved people across the region, herdsmen, farm laborers, other escaped gladiators, began flocking to Spartacus's growing camp. What started as 70 men became, by some ancient estimates, a force of over 70,000 by the rebellion's height, though modern historians treat these ancient figures with caution. What made this force dangerous wasn't just numbers. It was that Spartacus, likely drawing on his own military background before enslavement, organized former field laborers and untrained escapees into a functioning fighting force. Something Rome had never had to account for because a slave uprising simply wasn't supposed to be capable of coordinated warfare. Over the following 2 years, this army didn't just survive. It dismantled Roman force after Roman force sent to crush it. Several praetors and even both consuls of Rome, the highest elected military commanders in the Republic, were defeated by Spartacus's army in the field. Rome had stopped calling this a policing matter. It didn't have a better word yet, but it was starting to understand it might be losing. Here's the part that doesn't fit the legend as cleanly. Spartacus's plan, according to several ancient historians, was to lead his forces north, out of Italy entirely, over the Alps, and disperse them back to their home regions. Gaul, Thrace, wherever freedom actually meant something reachable. Not everyone agreed. A significant portion of his own army, accounts differ on numbers and reasoning, broke off, preferring to continue raiding and plundering through Italy rather than leave it behind. Some historians attribute this to differing goals among the escaped slaves themselves. Freedom for some meant escape, but for others it meant continuing to take from the people who'd taken from them. Spartacus turned back to try to hold his coalition together. The unified force that had beaten Roman armies was no longer entirely unified in what it was fighting for. This is a detail worth sitting with. Even the men fighting for their own freedom couldn't fully agree on what freedom, once won, was supposed to look like. Mastery over Roman legions turned out to be easier than mastery over a divided cause. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Roman history, ambitious, politically hungry, and deeply embarrassed that a slave revolt had made fools of Rome's consuls. He raised and personally funded a massive force, reportedly around 6 legions, and notably revived an old and brutal punishment, decimation. When part of his own force fled from an early engagement with Spartacus's army, Crassus had roughly 1 in every 10 men in the retreating units executed by their own comrades to remind the rest exactly what fear should look like. This wasn't a general trying to outfight Spartacus tactically. This was a general trying to out-terrify him, to make his own soldiers more afraid of Crassus than of the enemy in front of them. Spartacus was facing a Rome that had finally stopped underestimating him and had decided to answer overwhelming resourcefulness with overwhelming resources. Cornered in the toe of Italy, Spartacus attempted to negotiate passage across the strait to Sicily with Cilician pirates, hoping to continue the fight or the escape went from there. The pirates took payment and abandoned the deal, according to Roman sources, though the full truth of what happened may be lost to history. Crassus, meanwhile, had his forces dig a massive fortified trench and wall across the peninsula, attempting to trap Spartacus's army in the toe of Italy entirely. An extraordinary defensive engineering effort, essentially attempting to besiege an entire rebel army in the open field. Spartacus broke through this line in a snowy night engagement, proving yet again that even Rome's most determined containment effort couldn't fully hold him. But breaking through wasn't the same as breaking free. He'd escaped the trap. He hadn't escaped the war. 71 BC. With Crassus's legions closing in, and Pompey's forces arriving from the north to help finish what Crassus started, Spartacus made his final stand. Ancient sources describe him attempting, in the chaos of the battle, to personally fight his way through the ranks toward Crassus himself, killing 2 centurions who crossed his path, according to Plutarch, in an effort to reach the general and end this the way gladiators were trained to, one-on-one. He never reached him. Spartacus fell in that final battle. His body, according to ancient accounts, was never definitively identified afterward among the dead. One final refusal to give Rome a clean, confirmed ending to point to. Roughly 6,000 surviving members of his army were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road leading into Rome, left up for months as a deliberate, visible warning to anyone else who might get the same idea. Rome had won. Rome made absolutely sure everyone knew it. Rome erased almost everything it could about who Spartacus actually was, where exactly he was born, what he looked like, even his final resting place. What it couldn't erase was what he proved, that the machine built to convince men they were property could be broken by the men it was built to break. He didn't win the war. He's still remembered as the reason Rome had to prove, brutally, publicly, along an entire road of crosses, that losing to an idea like his was the only outcome it could afford to allow. That's the part of this story that matters more than the battles. Sometimes the forge isn't about winning. Sometimes it's about proving something can survive being broken at all, and being remembered for it long after the ones who broke you are forgotten as anything but the ones who had to. Stories like this, the ones where mastery doesn't guarantee the ending, are why this channel exists. Every warrior we cover here was forged the same way, through discipline, through failure, through the long, unglamorous work of standing for something even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's another warrior waiting in the forge. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, hit like and let the channel know. That's The Forged Arc.